Welcome to Generation AI, the show where we explore how AI is reshaping our generation. I'm Derek Stahl. Right now, we're in the middle of a record construction boom for data centers as companies race to build out the infrastructure needed for AI. Arizona has become the fastest growing hub in the country for these things. And right now, the debate over development is front and center at the state capitol.
To pay for ongoing investments, I am proposing one key action. Make data centers pay their fair share for the water they use.
On the first day of this year's legislative session, Governor Katie Hobbs urged state lawmakers to pass new water use fees on data centers and eliminate the state's long-running data center tax exemption. She said if data centers pay a fee of about 1 cent per gallon, it would generate millions of dollars that could be used for water conservation efforts. However, Republican state lawmakers are wary of doing anything that might scare off investment.
There is a national security perspective on data centers. We know China is building them at record speeds. So I want to make sure that whatever our policy is related to data centers, that it's responsible, that it meets the growing needs for Arizona's tech industry.
Right now, there are about 140 data centers in the Phoenix area, and dozens more are waiting in the wings. But questions of water use and electricity have come up repeatedly in City Hall debates over development, including this one in Chandler.
We see in other cities again and again and again, these AI data centers are stealing resources. We live in the desert. We can't waste water. They will waste water. They're going to create pollution, noise, toxins that none of these residents want to see.
So that's the question. Do data centers waste water? How much water and how much electricity do they actually use? My guest today has written extensively about data centers and their environmental impacts. He's a former high school science teacher turned blogger who's become a trusted source on data centers for academics, and he's been interviewed by the New York Times. Andy Maisley, welcome to Generation AI.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here, and I want to start with a quote from a book. The book is Empire of AI by Karen Howe, and she writes, according to an estimate from researchers at the University of California, Riverside, surging AI demand could use 1.1 trillion to 1.7 trillion gallons of predominantly fresh water globally a year by 2027, or half the water annually withdrawn in the UK. That's a lot of gallons, and the sentence certainly sounds alarming. Andy, is it as bad as it sounds?
I wouldn't say so. So, I mean, like to start off, Karen very cordially corrected that part of her book as in response to a blog post I wrote, basically. So this is kind of how I drew national attention to myself, basically. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about this. First of all, the number itself definitely sounds large. I'll say this is actually a pretty clear case of how it's very easy to frame water use in a bunch of different ways that can sometimes make it sound very alarming. So what that paragraph is doing, which I worry about, is almost all of the water that's described there, all of that 1.7 trillion gallons per year, is specifically water that is withdrawn and then returned to the source specifically. And I'm not sure that that was a very accurate comparison to like half of the UK's water, just because I think what she was comparing that to was the like household water use of people in the UK, which is mostly not returned to the source specifically. In general, we use water in a ton of different ways in society. We use it in industrial processes. We use it for farming. Obviously, we also use it in our personal lives. And it's very easy to frame almost any water use as being in terms of millions or billions or even trillions of gallons, just because we use a lot of water in almost every aspect of our lives. And so I worry that when people read that, there are a lot of different directions they can take it that don't always land in an entirely accurate picture of like what the current situation with AI and water is.
Yeah, what you're getting at is an important distinction that I only really learned after reading your writing, and you wrote that there's a big difference between the words withdrawn and consumed, and it seems like, you know, in this instance, we're talking about water that gets recycled and put back in the source. It's not like all that water is being, you know, evaporated.
Yeah, 100%. So data centers themselves definitely evaporate most of the water that they use on site specifically, but that cost is really a tiny amount of the total water that's involved in the process, just because almost all of the ways that we generate electricity in America and everywhere else actually involves heating water to spin turbines specifically. And a lot of the water that's used by power plants is ultimately returned to sources mostly unaffected. And so it's very easy to multiply anything's water cost by like 20 times or so if you include all of that withdrawn water that's basically returned back unaffected. And it's not to say that that has no impact at all. Like even taking water out of an ecosystem for a little while can cause some problems. But it's definitely very far from the picture that I think that paragraph was trying to paint, where I think a lot of people would read that paragraph and come away thinking that data centers themselves are going to be like consuming inside of the buildings themselves as much water as half of the United Kingdom. And that is completely wrong, basically. Like the actual on-site cost of AI in data centers is actually quite small and isn't really forecast to grow to a really noticeable amount within America, even by 2030 or so. Like the best number I have for that is that by 2030, all of AI data centers in America together, and all data centers combined actually, will probably be using about 1% of the water cost of America's irrigated corn right now, which is definitely not nothing. It's definitely something to worry about. And I'm happy that policymakers are focused on this. But it's very different than the complete catastrophe for water management that some people paint data centers as. So the more I dug into this, the more I found similar issues with how numbers like this were reported.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just sort of saying explicitly to the audience that that water that's used on site is used to cool these computers. There's lots and lots of computers in data centers. That's why they need these things to power all the cloud infrastructure necessary for AI. And I learned from your writing that only about 20% of the water that's used associated with data centers is used on site. 80% is used for that electricity generation offsite. And I have some numbers here that you put together from Maricopa County specifically. And you wrote that Maricopa County will use about 905 million gallons of water in data centers in 2025. Compare that to golf courses in Maricopa County. Golf courses in our county will use about 29 billion gallons of water each year. And if you break that number down a little bit differently in terms of the daily water use here in Maricopa County, the county uses about 2.13 billion gallons of water each and every day. Data centers use 0.12% of that water. Golf courses use 3.8%. And so I want to ask you why you wanted to make that comparison to golf courses specifically. Golf is obviously, it's an important pastime here in the state of Arizona. Are you arguing that if people are in favor of golf courses, they should also be in favor of data centers?
It's a little bit more complicated because I realize that most of the people who are criticizing data center water use are probably not super excited about golf either. I think the main thing I was trying to get across there is that because data centers generate so much tax revenue specifically, they're actually really quite resource efficient from the perspective of how much water you put in compared to how much tax revenue you get out of them. And so that golf point was the first of like a two-part graph that I had produced, where in the second part, I show that even though data centers are only using about 1/30th of the water used by golf courses, they seem to be generating more total revenue for local and state governments in Arizona specifically. And that's just because they're ultimately what's happening with data centers is they're one associated with some of the most lucrative companies in the world right now, and two, what's basically happening inside data centers themselves is they're basically passing water in the vicinity of hot computers to cool them down a little bit. And if you think about that, just passing water near a slightly warmed computer that might have heated up after it answered a question for you, comparing that water use to say like the water use of keeping a huge golf course up and running, it's just much more likely that the golf course is both going to be way more intense in how much water it uses and also probably generate less revenue per drop of water. Like I'm not sure that every individual blade of grass on a golf course is actually super useful to it functioning. Whereas like the data center, like every individual drop is associated with some question or some other computer process that someone somewhere thought was important enough to send into the computer in the first place. And so basically my argument there is that if I were living in Arizona personally, which to flag, I am not, I'm far away in Washington, D.C. But if I were living there and I were trying to decide which is the most water efficient industry to have in the state, from the perspective of how much tax revenue I want to generate, I would personally want fewer golf courses and more data centers if I were trying to maximize the amount of tax revenue that I had access to. Um, and then more broadly, there's a point that comes up a lot that showed up in that one of the first videos that you showed, which is this idea that, oh, we live in a desert, like we can't waste water. And it's true that Arizonans should be very careful with the water they use, obviously. Like, I realize you all basically live in this amazing city built in a desert that pumps water in from all over. Like, that's really cool, I think. But at the same time, if that city is going to exist, if like you're going to have a society in the desert, basically, it seems like you're also going to need some kind of taxable industry to just keep things afloat. And between data centers and golf courses, my impression is that data centers are actually just better for a lot of communities per unit of water that they use compared to most other options that people have for raising tax revenue. So that was the argument I was trying to make there.
Yeah, and we showed on the screen there, 50 times more tax revenue is generated per unit of water comparing data centers to golf courses. So it's pretty remarkable. But just to finish that thought, Andy, as we head to break, off the top, we had that viewer say data centers waste water. Based on your research, how efficient are they with their water?
A lot of this ultimately, unfortunately, depends on how efficient you think AI is, and there's wildly different takes about this. I think by any normal standard, though, every time you send any one individual AI prompt, and I should flag that data centers are used for a lot more than AI. They're used for just supporting the general infrastructure of the internet. Um, if you look at how much any one individual AI prompt uses in terms of water, it's probably going to be only about 1/800,000th of your total water footprint throughout the day. It's just incredibly small because
And I want to
ultimately,
get
again,
into that right after the break. We're going to talk
sounds
all
great.
about individual water impacts and this idea that folks are using up to 1 bottle of water every time they type a prompt into ChatGPT. Maybe you've heard that claim. Well, Andy's going to debunk that right after the break. Stay with us. More Generation AI after this. And we're back with AI environmental blogger Andy Maisley, who writes on Substack. Andy, let's talk about the individual water impact of using chatbots. A couple of years ago, some scientists at UC Riverside estimated that each 100-word AI prompt uses about 1 bottle of water, or 519 milliliters of water. That number went everywhere. A lot of people have heard about that. What have you learned about the amount of water used per prompt?
Yeah, a ton to say about that. First of all, just going back to that study. So that study has been really radically misunderstood. At the time, they had found that it was more like 15 to 20 prompts per bottle of water. The issue is that the Washington Post had run this story that said a bottle of water per email based on this report, this study specifically. And they had basically implied that, oh, maybe if you use like 10 prompts to send a single email, then this will eventually add up to be a full bottle of water. And at the time, that study was pretty good. They were working with the best information that we had. But since then, a lot more has come out. And also AI chips have also just become radically more efficient. I think something else that's missing from this conversation a lot is that on average, just AI chips are becoming so much more efficient over time that the average water and energy costs are actually going down per prompt, at least right now. And so a lot of people are still walking around with this completely incorrect idea, I think, that each individual prompt uses a full bottle of water.
So how much does each prompt use based on what we've learned?
Yeah, my basic understanding is that if you include every single part of the water cost, basically, which a lot of people really push me on, like it's not just the prompt, it's the training of the AI model, it's the infrastructure and things like that. Altogether, it seems to be around 1 milliliter of water, which is about 1/500th of a bottle of water specifically. And obviously, this has a range of uncertainty because different prompts have different lengths, but on average, it seems to land around 1 milliliter of water per prompt. And just to put this in perspective, this is about like 1, maybe 200,000th of your daily water footprint overall, because almost everything that you do also carries a water cost with it, because again, we just use water in so many different ways, basically. So the only way that you could significantly increase your water footprint with AI is to spend literally all day sending something like 2,000 prompts and reading all of the responses. And my basic argument in my blog is that if you were doing this, if you were spending all day sending 2,000 prompts and reading all of those, you probably wouldn't be doing a lot of other things that also use a lot of water. So even just using electricity in other places, or like, I don't know, using your car, like refining gasoline involves water and stuff like that. And it's actually very likely that someone spending all their day doing nothing but poking around on AI is actually using significantly less water than the average person, just because our digital infrastructure in general is just so efficient compared to most of the other things that we do. Especially like if you go to a golf course or something,
right?
Like your expected water cost is going to be pretty high for the day.
And there's a number I pulled from your website, from some of your writing, that said if you were to send 8,000 ChatGPT prompts per day for an entire year, that is what would increase your personal water footprint by 1%. So it would really take a remarkable amount of ChatGPT to just increase your personal water footprint by just a tiny, tiny amount. You're someone who obviously cares very deeply about the environment and your individual environmental footprint. I think you're a vegetarian or a vegan because of, you're mindful of your output and your footprint. Why are you spending so much time pushing back on the environmental narratives around data centers and arguing essentially that they're not as significant as a concern that people might think?
A lot of different reasons. The main one is I'm pretty worried that a lot of everyday people who care a lot about the environment are getting really wildly misinformed about who the actual big bad guys are here. A few weeks ago, a friend was in a pizza place and had overheard two teenagers talking, and one of them had said like, oh, this mutual friend of ours claims to be an environmentalist, but she uses ChatGPT. Isn't that crazy? And then she had immediately gone over and ordered like a meat lover's pizza specifically. And like my claim is that if you're worried about water anyway, like meat and animal agriculture is just such a clear win for like reducing your footprint compared to AI. And I'm pretty worried that people like that person had a genuinely very good motivation to reduce their water footprint, because there are a lot of ways that we should reduce our water and energy, obviously. But because everybody has very limited amounts of time to actually think about this and adjust their behavior, if you put that much effort into not doing something like never prompting AI because of this, I basically think you're losing out on all of these much more promising ways to reduce both your emissions and your water consumption specifically. So I basically think it's a minor tragedy when someone who genuinely cares about water issues decides that the sole thing they should do is boycott AI. I just don't think that's going to move the needle at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the big motivations for writing about it more.
I see. So it's helping people kind of pick the right battles and fight the right wars. Stay with us. We are going to have much more with Andy Maisley right after the break. We're going to be talking about AI data centers and electricity. Could data centers affect the rates that you and I pay for power? Generation AI continues after this. Welcome back to Generation AI. Right now, some data center developers who would like to build in Arizona are getting turned away. Arizona's utilities are telling them they can't serve them because they require so much energy. My colleague Morgan Lowe spoke with APS.
Do you have the electric generation capacity and transmission capacity to serve every data center that wants to come to the valley right now?
So we have made commitments to certain amount of that energy to serve, but we do not have the energy and transmission infrastructure to support the amount of energy that's being requested of us.
This one particular data center at 40th Street and Loop 202 requires its own electrical substation. And that APS official tells us it's going to take years to meet the electricity demand. We're back with data center blogger Andy Maisley. Andy, I think a lot of people are concerned out there that utilities will build out electrical infrastructure for the data centers and then pass on the costs to the consumers. How legitimate do you think those concerns are?
I think this is very legitimate, much more so than the water issue. I think part of the issue that I've had with the water dialogue on a national level is that I think it's distracting from the much more serious challenge of how AI generates electricity and where it gets electricity from. And there are definitely clear cases that we know of where utilities have, in fact, passed on the costs of new infrastructure that were mainly built to service data centers to consumers. So that aspect of the story is definitely correct. It's concerning, and like every citizen considering stuff like this should definitely be aware of that as one potential downside of data centers moving in. I do worry that the potential tax revenue versus the increase in electricity bills might not be fully appreciated. a lot of the time, where there also seem to be a lot of cases where it is both the case that the average person's electricity bill went up, but the county that the data centers were built in just received so much additional tax revenue as well that in a lot of worlds, I would personally take that trade-off if I were living in that county. Like if a county is generating something like $100 additional per person in tax revenue that they can use for city services for every, say, like $1 that the average person's energy bill goes up, I would personally be fine if my energy bill went up by $1 a month if it meant that, you know, services got significantly more funded. And so I'm not saying that's an easy question. I think each individual citizen and each individual location should struggle with that for themselves and try to think about what are the trade-offs that I accept here. But I do worry that a lot of times just one side of that story is being presented where people aren't given the opportunity to make the full trade-off on their own. And they just hear that they raise electricity prices without the corresponding benefits.
That's an interesting argument. We know that nationally, energy prices have risen over the past few years. You looked at sort of a national picture in 2025. How much of those rising energy prices are attributable to data centers? Is that the main driver?
At the national level, I'm pretty skeptical that data centers have really budged the average total American energy cost, at least right now. It's partly just because they mainly raise electricity prices by requiring new infrastructure to be built. And this is often a temporary cost where the new infrastructure is built and there's a lot of cost associated with building it that can sometimes last a very long time if the utility takes out a loan.
You've also written in the past that really it's about inflation has driven up prices since 2020, the war in Ukraine, things like that, that there are these national drivers. But as you noted earlier, there have been regional examples of data centers driving up electricity costs. And I want to bring up one right here on the full screen. Groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council have done analysis, and they've looked at, in particular, like regions in the East Coast, areas around Virginia, where they have a lot of data centers, and they found that it has driven up prices for families. In one 13-state region, the NRDC wrote that by 2028, an average family in that region will end up paying about $70 a month extra on their electricity bills because of forecasted data center growth. $70 is not nothing, Andy. I mean, folks, you know, could potentially feel that if the companies aren't bearing the brunt of these costs themselves.
Yeah, and there are basically two ways to think about this, I think. The first one is I definitely want policy that's designed to make sure that data centers do actually internalize these costs. Like, these are not AI companies are not exactly struggling right now. Like, they're doing very well. And I think that if states impose, you know, specific plans or specific tax policies or utility policies that make sure that data centers aren't passing these on to consumers, or the utilities aren't passing these costs on to consumers as well, I just think that's a win-win for everyone. So on that level, I do think that the average person should probably be advocating more for policies that make sure they do internalize those costs.
And
utilities
who
also
is advocating for that is President Trump. Take a look at something he wrote last month. He wrote that I never want Americans to pay higher electricity bills because of data centers. We are the hottest country in the world and #1 in AI. Data centers are key to that boom and keeping Americans free and secure, but the big technology companies who build them must pay their own way. And shortly after that post from the president, we had both Microsoft and OpenAI come out with pledges of their own, basically promising to pay their own way when it comes to electricity cost, also ensuring that they restore or recharge more water than they use. What do you think of those announcements?
I think these all make complete sense to me. I'm definitely not super pushy on like, oh, everyone just has to be fine with data centers. I was a little bit skeptical in that opening clip when one of the politicians had said, oh, this is a national security issue. We need to build as many data centers as possible. Like that also, I think people should be pretty wary of. And so I think there's a pretty good middle ground here where data centers can both really benefit specific communities. Like going back to Northern Virginia, like I live a few towns away from Loudoun County where the most data centers in the world are right now. It's also the wealthiest county in the world. And most of the people, most most of the tax revenue that the county gets, or at least about like 30 or 40%, seems to come from the data center industry specifically. And so even though people's costs have gone up, my impression is that on net, the average person in that county is way wealthier than they would otherwise be, and their services are just much better run as a result of the data centers being there. And so there are specific policy examples you can look at of a really good relationship between data centers and local governments, but it's not guaranteed. Like, there are definitely a lot of cases where, say, the utility has a very strong interest in both building out a lot of new capacity to service these new, very lucrative customers, while also making it very attractive to the data centers by basically passing on the cost to everyday people. So I think people should be very skeptical there. But I do also worry that people can take a very extreme reaction in the other direction and say, oh, these data centers are just stealing all our resources and there's no upside whatsoever. And I don't think that's the case either. I think there are just plenty of cases where there's a really good symbiotic relationship between data centers and local government.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. A lot of folks are sort of misinformed about data centers. Policymakers need to step in, but I think you did a great job in this conversation, Andy, of kind of breaking down fact and fiction when it comes to these data centers. You can find Andy Maisley on Substack. He does great writing over there. Andy, thanks so much for being on Generation AI.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, us too. Hey, we'll be back with another episode of Generation AI next week. We'll see you in the future.